Alright, so this is how I kind of go about setting up a wiring diagram for the bike. I know the major components where I want them, so what I do first and foremost is I start off with just a simple sketch of all the big components that I know I need, right? So in this sketch, the bike is kind of going to be going this direction, right? So front wheel, back wheel, gas tank would be up in here, Springer front end would be out in here, something like that, so you can kind of picture the engine compartment. And so to run through the components, like anytime somebody asks me a question about wiring, my first question is, well, what all components do you want? Do you want turn signals? Do you want headlights, brake, tail lights? Do you want license plate light? Do you want horn? All that kind of stuff. Here's what I'm going to run on the shovel mutt, on Muttley. So starting off with the engine, first and foremost, is the Dyna S dual fire ignition. So this bike does not have points. It's not any electronic ignition. It's one of the Dyna S, which is still like a mechanical ignition. Right back from that, on the engine, you can picture the V of the engine, the shovel head right here. On the back of the engine is the oil pressure switch. I am going to be running dummy lights on this so that I can see if I lose oil pressure. So on the back of the engine is the oil pressure switch, kind of right behind that. So here's the transmission. I know that I'm going to run a neutral switch as well. So when I hit neutral in the transmission, it sends a light up that I can see. I'm going to be running foot clutch hand shift on this bike, and it's my first time with a foot clutch hand shift, so I want to know when I hit neutral. So I'm going to have a neutral switch there. Kind of up from that in this big center area is really where all the heavy lifting comes. So that's the battery. So I got a positive and negative terminal on the battery. I know I'm going to be running a kind of a distribution block. So I'm going to be running like inline fuses, but I wanted to distribute that power into two separate lines for fuses. I'll talk about that in a second. As always, with any chopper wiring diagram, you are going to have at least one primary circuit breaker. And this kind of terminal block, I think, has 3 jumpers, 3 setups there. In addition to this, kind of in the brains, inside the oil tank cavity, is going to be, right next to it actually, is the primary key switch. So that's the key switch. On this bike is just on off. This is a kick only bike, so this key is just going to function on and off. Shut the bike off completely, secure it down, and I can take the key with me and nobody can start the bike unless they hotwire it. And then just up from that is, if you saw my Instagram, a little plate that I made to be able to mount a simple toggle switch. This is my high beam switch. And so these little toggle switches, the ones I run, have the little light in them, so you can see when they're on. They're kind of cool, old school trucker style. They have a ground tab, and then a hot tab, and an extra hot tab. So we'll talk about that in a sec, but that switch will go there. Coming back to the engine, right, so here's the V. On the other side of the bike is the coils. So on this bike, it is a dual plug shovel head. That means each head has 2 spark plugs, which means I have a total of 4 spark plugs, which means I need 2 coils. 2 coils to run with this, and they're special coils. We can talk about that in another video, but essentially from Dynatech Ignitions, you can look up their information and find out, based on your ignition module and what engine configuration you have, you can get the recommended, whether street or race, coil specs, coil packs, whether it's 1.5 ohm like these, or 3 ohm or 5 ohm, and those are all different configurations for different ignition systems. This is an alternator bike. It's not a generator bike, it's an alternator bike, and so I'm just going to sketch in the regulator, which is up front. Most of you are familiar with that. It's got the little fins on it, and it has 2 wires that go to the alternator and stator, or stator and rotor, I guess technically, but I'm not going to draw those in here because those are staying on the bike. I'm not touching those. There is one feed that comes out of here that'll connect back to the charging circuit, but the regulator is up front. I got that to mess with. Let's see, also from oil switch, neutral switch. I also have a rear brake light switch. This is a juice rear. It's a brake rotor, so hydraulic master cylinder rear brake, and it has an inline switch. So when that brake hose pressurizes, it pressures the switch, connects the current, and that'll go up to a tail light. So I got one tail light on this bike, one tail light. All the way up at the front of the bike then is a couple things. So I got dual headlights, 1/1, and then in the top headlight bucket, if you saw the Instagram post, I put two little dummy lights, warning lights. One of them is green, that's going to light up when I hit neutral, and one of them is red, which is going to hook up to the oil pressure switch. If the oil pressure stops, I'll get a warning light that something's wrong with the oil in the system. That's my components. That's my whole Lego bin of stuff that I need to connect and need to wire up. And so the next kind of big question is, okay, now that I have all this, what's the best way to connect the dots? How do these parts and pieces come together? And this is where a lot of like wiring diagrams, if you go on Google Images and search like shovel head chopper wiring diagram and go to images, the one warning I'll put out there is that if you go to Google Images, you're going to get every image that's posted online anywhere from anybody in any forum. And a lot of those forums are actually posts where dudes will post like, hey, what do you guys think about this wiring diagram? And it might have stuff wrong with it that other guys comment down in that forum thread. Hey, this goes here and this should go there. So don't rely on Google Images, please. Whatever you do, that's like the worst thing you can do. Go to a forum, go to a thread, read up, watch videos. Don't just watch my video here, watch other videos too. Learn as much as you can about simple wiring diagrams, what works and what doesn't, the rules to follow, and do your homework. So if you have any other questions, this is my plug right now. If you have any questions about this stuff, you can get my email address. It's bpeak82@gmail.com. Feel free to hit me up with any questions you have along the way about doing your own wiring diagram, and I will be happy to help if I can. I am not going to guarantee that I have all the answers, but if I know the answer, I am happy to help. Okay, so about this diagram, simple things first, right? So the very first obvious is that the negative terminal on the battery has to go to a ground, and for these bikes, it's going to go to the frame, because everything else that's grounded, so I'll jump ahead a little bit, every one of these headlights and taillights typically comes with 3 wires: a ground wire, a hot in for normal running, and an extra hot in for high beam or brake. Without this battery grounded to frame, the ground wire on any electronic would have to literally run a wire all the way back to the battery. In addition, you would have to ground out your cylinder heads and your engine back to the battery somehow with a wire to make the spark plugs work and make everything function properly. So the way to get around all of that mess is ground your frame. Your frame becomes basically a physically solid, rigid wire that everything else can ground to connect it back to the negative terminal of the battery. Which means if this negative wire, if this ground wire has a crap connection to your frame, you're going to have a crap connection of all your wiring. Just forget all of it. So this is the simplest wire to install, but also, I would say, one of the most important. Ground your battery properly to nice bare metal. Make sure that your engine, when it's installed in the frame, has nice engine to frame metal connection. If you paint or powder coat your frame, make sure you grind off that paint or powder coat on the engine mounts, because that engine has to be grounded to the frame, grounded back to this negative terminal on the battery. Again, if you got magneto bike or no battery bike, that's a different story. Go do your homework. But when you're running a battery, ground it to the frame. Have I said it enough? Ground it to the frame. All right, so then from there, if you've seen my Ironhead chopper wiring videos, I'll try and break this down as best I can into the different circuit programs. So for this bike, there's a charging circuit, right? So I said there's a stator and a rotor. There's an alternator charging system that goes to a regulator, and that regulator makes sure that the current that is built up from the engine itself is always maintaining a constant voltage and amperage. This wire basically has to go back and connect to the positive terminal on the battery. That's where it needs to go. That's recharging the battery. However, before I draw this line and connect it on up to the positive terminal on the battery, I want to take a side step here to the circuit breaker. This circuit breaker is your last line of defense or first line of defense against this battery having a serious meltdown and 3-mile islanding your entire bike. If anything goes wrong in the rest of this system, your whole hope and prayer is that this circuit breaker works. It's going to click off, it's going to shut down everything else, and it's going to prevent this battery from either overheating, catching fire, exploding, leaking all over the place, or causing something else really bad to go wrong. So this circuit breaker is key. On it, you're going to typically find one silver post, one copper post, and if I remember correctly, the copper post is usually your battery terminal. So I'm going to assume in this case that this back one is the copper right here. So before you just hook up your regulator to your positive post of your battery, take it to, I should say. Let's come this way. Your circuit breaker. And then run a wire from your breaker, same post, to your battery. Now, if you have a runaway charging, this is a constant connection to your battery terminal. I get that. It's this other post that separates the rest of your bike. So I guess I said that wrong a second ago. This circuit breaker protects everything else except for your charging circuit from your battery. Those go hand in hand. So as far as charging goes, on this type of bike, that's really all that's needed. When you have a generator bike that has another separate regulator, there's wiring between those that you want to be careful of to set up your generator properly, that you don't mess up the generator. Alternator bikes, especially if you're doing a chopper rewire like this is, 9 times out of 10 you'll have a decent stator and rotor, a decent regulator. You can just tie into those and run it this way. Always put in a new circuit breaker, please. They're like $3 from an auto parts store. It's worth it. Get a new circuit breaker every time you do a rewire. That's charging. So then from there, basically now we have hot coming from the battery into this breaker. Now this other post, the silver post, is hot all the time. No matter what happens with the key, the silver post is hot. And it needs to send juice to the rest of the bike. The next stop on the gravy train, for me, is up to the key. So from this hot lead around to the key. And I know electricity is not like plumbing, but I sometimes think of it that way. Like water flows in a direction of a pipe, and in a sense, electricity flows in a direction of a pipe. Everything has to loop back around to the negative and push through and loop back around. So in this diagram here, you're coming off the positive terminal, you got hot coming to the circuit breaker, hot coming out of the circuit breaker and into the key. The key then is a stop. It's a switch. It's an on-off. It either allows current to proceed or stops current from proceeding on to the next station. And for me, I'm going out to the next station, which is this terminal block. Now the whole reason I'm doing the terminal block is to just have a little bit more flexibility in taking one wire and splitting it into 2 or 3. It just makes life a little bit easier rather than doing like a crimp connection or a 2-in-1 connection. And plus the bike had a terminal block. It was a 6-lug terminal block, so I just cut it in half and used 3. So I can bring a switched hot wire into the terminal block, loop it around so that one side is hot when the key is on. Out of the other side, I'm going to bring 2 leads. Now, some of these terminal blocks, you can buy them from an auto parts store where it's a terminal block and has the fuses built in. That's what I wanted, but the one that the auto parts store had was physically too big to fit in the space where I had available for it. So again, kind of referring back to the Instagram channel, at bpeak82, you might have seen I 3D printed a battery tray these two pieces sit on top of the battery tray, and in the battery tray are going to be the inline fuses. So just run-of-the-mill inline blade-style fuses. Bringing power out of this terminal block to those two fuses, you know, the kind with the little flip-up lid, and then the little bayonet-style fuses just dip right in there. One of these feeds, one of these hot wire feeds coming out, switched hot, is going to go to the coils and spark plug in the ignition system. The other one is going to be all my accessories. So accessories is going to be taillight, headlights, idiot lights, and the switches that are needed to control those pieces. So let's do the coil and ignition first. So again, this is a Dyna S dual fire ignition. Out of this comes a white wire and a blue wire. And for this, you're going to follow the manufacturer's instructions for how to hook up these coils, especially on a dual coil, because the white and the blue have to go to a certain one in a certain order based on where your switched hot is coming in. So I'm going to rattle this off, but don't take this as gospel. You got to look up your own specs of coils and setup for the rules. And if you need help with that, again, shoot me an email. Glad to help. But basically, the way this one works, there's a white wire, and I'll just put a little W. It's going to come up, and I'm drawing it this way because this is my backbone between the engine and transmission, and I know I'm starting to get an idea of, like, okay, with all these components roughly where they're at, how am I going to get from point A to point B? So not just drawing random straight lines all over the place, but I'm trying to think through, like, where's that wire going to go? I know that this is going to go from the side of the engine up the backbone, loop around in the top tube of the frame. I'm sorry, go up through the seat post and then through the backbone and then down to the coils. So that's the white wire. And I know on the Dyna specs, the white wire connects to this lug of the coils. And that lug that white wire connects to is the same exact wire that gets the switched hot. So as my pen dies, so this one here is switched hot. So when the key is on, that little bad boy is energized. From there, the other lug on this coil jumps over to the other coil. And then also coming out of this is a blue wire. Remember I said white and blue come out of the Dyna S. This blue wire is going to come all the way around and connect to the other side of the coil. So I'll basically have at this point, three wires going up through the seat post and three wires coming out of the backbone into the coils, and then obviously the spark plug wires, which I won't draw on here because spark plug wires are spark plug wires. Hopefully you know what those are. That takes care of the ignition to the coils to the spark, all from this one fused wire right here. Again, all that system is double backed up between itself and the battery by the circuit breaker. So that's the charging circuit and the ignition circuit. And so basically all that's left then is I got to get power out to these accessory pieces. And this is where it gets kind of tricky, because what I'm going to have to do is somehow bring this one switched hot fused wire. I draw it in green there, and I know I'm looping around. I have a switched hot wire here with current or electricity, theoretically incorrectly, flowing this direction. And what I'm actually going to do here, instead of doing a fuse block or terminal, I am going to do a splitter, just a little joint, little joint, with a wire that comes up to my high beam switch. and a wire that comes down all the way through the seat post, out under the bike, and to the rear brake light switch. That's the rear brake light switch. So now I have hot, so when I turn the key on, I'll have juice coming to my high beam switch and my rear brake light switch. So from there, that standard hot is also going to go up. I'm gonna bring it off that same tab off the rear brake light switch and the same tab off of the high beam switch. The little adapter connector end that I'll use to go on this, I'll put 2 wires into that same terminal. And what I'll do is bring that hot also out to the standard hot of the rear brake. Remember, this bottom one is ground. I just got to find a good spot on the frame by the rear brake light or the sissy bar or anything that has good ground. We'll use test lights to figure that out. Headlights have grounds too. I'll either ground them individually or I'll run a wire that connects the grounds and then just ground to one point. We'll see how that goes. But again, I got switched hot coming in, switched hot coming all the way down, and switched hot hitting the switch but also continuing on to the standard. So when the key goes on, the rear brake light comes on. Now, you can do certain keys, like this is a 3-position key, so there actually is another lug here. I haven't tested this switch yet. I need to run it on the test light and some spare batteries to test. There is an ignition and an on. So if I wanted to, I could turn it to ignition and kick the bike over and then eventually turn it to on and get all the lights on. We'll see. For now, I think I'm just going to keep it simple. Kick-only bike doesn't need a whole lot of cranking amps, and these batteries got plenty of juice to run lights and fire the kickstart. So that's the standard in. But here's the cool part then. So with this one single standard hot coming into the rear brake light switch and then going out to the low, then all you got to do is run another wire from the rear brake light switch that goes out. I'm going to cross over, that goes to the actual brake, high brake light. So once you bring hot in, this switch handles the rest, and you take 2 wires out of it. One's kind of low beam, one's kind of high beam. You can kind of think of it that way. And in the same way, the high beam toggle switch has a ground. Not all these toggle switches have a ground, but I like that this one does, because if anything gets weird, it'll fix itself. I got hot coming in, and then this standard hot will also have another feed coming out and hitting the low beam of the top headlight, and straight out of that I'll bring a wire down and hit the low beam on the second headlight. If you don't have 2 headlights, you can make this a whole lot easier on yourself. So by drawing this line, again, this standard switched hot in, standard switched hot in, standard switched hot to each headlight. And then the remaining tab on the high beam toggle is your high beam. So when you flip this to high beam on this type of brake light switch and this type of high beam switch, when you flip it, it doesn't switch from one tab to another. I should clarify that. When you flip this switch, it energizes both tabs. So that way your low and high beam are working together. You want to check this. So every time I buy parts for a bike, headlights, switches, toggles, you name it, I always keep a spare battery laying around, and I just do some bench testing with some leads and some alligator roach clips and some test lights, because you want to make sure that that is the case. Like, if this toggle switch was one where it literally flipped from this pole to this pole, then you're going to need to wire this a little bit differently from what I'm actually describing. Most of these 12-volt systems, if you flip the switch, it keeps the power to the first pole and adds power to the second pole. So that's what we're going to do here. So that when it adds power to the second pole, you get high beam hot coming into your high beam. And to get high beam on my second headlight, which is actually an amber headlight, I'll probably add high beam to it. I might not. I would just tie off of that top loop with basically 2 wires in one side of the same connector. to get a loop down coming for the high beam on the other light. So that's lights, that's headlight and tail light. Lastly are the idiot lights. Now a lot of guys on choppers won't run these, so basically if this is your bike, you can just stop right here. But for me, I like those little warning lights. I had them on my iron head and appreciated knowing that I had oil pressure. And so I'm gonna run them here. So the way these work, these idiot warning lights, the way these neutral switches and oil pressure switches are set up to run is you need to provide hot power to the light, and then the hot continues on down the line to the switch. Just one wire into each switch. When everything is in good working order, say you have oil pressure, that switch stays open, there's no contact, that hot wire is not grounded out to your engine and frame and the rest. Therefore, since it's not grounded, the light stays off, the circuit is not complete. But if the oil pressure dies, or if the bike is off, say I turn the key on, the bike is off, it's not running yet, there's no oil pressure yet, the switch will stay closed, it's now a completed electrical circuit and your light comes on. So with these warning lights, when you do them this way, you want to supply hot to the light first, and then a feed down that goes to the switch, and that's it. So the way I'm going to do that, I mounted these two little tiny LED lights into the headlight bucket, and I'll either add it onto the tail end of this video or onto a next video that shows all the components that we're talking about. But to get hot there, basically I'm just going to take another wire out of here. I hate putting this many wires in one feed. But I'm basically going to take a little wire, because these are just tiny little LEDs. Oh my goodness, like the wire size is like ridiculously thin wire. So there's not a lot of current here. You're not going to mess up the rest of this wiring by doing this. I'm going to take a hot off of one and into the other. So that provides hot to both. And then the extra wire that goes to each is going to have to basically go from the top here, all the way down the backbone, all the way down the seat post, and all the way around. Or, in this case, I think what I'm going to do is actually come down one of the front frame legs. So the two frame legs in front of the engine, I'm actually going to drill a hole in the frame, grommet it or rubber boot it, and actually bring these two wires together all the way down the frame, through the frame rail under the bike, and then somewhere under the bike where you can't see it, I'll drill a hole and pop out the other side. So all the wires will be concealed in the frame tubes. I'll do a little video on some of the options that you have for how to run wires and frame tubes of existing bikes. But one of them is going to basically just go to the oil pressure switch, and one of them is going to go to the neutral switch, and that's it. So once you get hot in to those warning lights, and whether those lights are here or like on my iron head, I had them on the top motor mount on the side of the bike. Doesn't matter where they're located. You can run them on the side of your tank. You can put them in your handlebars. All they need is hot first, switched hot into the lights, and then the other wire that comes out of them needs to go down to the oil pressure switch and neutral switch, because that's what's going to ground when there's no oil pressure, or in this case, the neutral switch on these 4 speeds and 5, the 4 speeds at least. When you hit neutral, there's a tab inside the transmission that when you hit neutral, it makes contact metal to metal and closes the circuit. And that's when that green light will light up to let me know I'm in that neutral position of the transmission gears and the rotary top. That's the wiring diagram. So just like a chef on a Food Network cooking show, I'm just going to pop this out of the oven and show you my next step. So after I draw something like this, I get all the main components, I start to think through where the wiring is going to go. My next step is to actually redraw it over a picture of the bike so that I can literally like estimate where these wires are going to run. Not only for where they're going to run, but I'm kind of a geek. I like to have colored wires, and I want to make sure that like these 4 wires coming down the seat post aren't all green. or 2 greens and 2 blacks. You want to switch it up to make sure that each of these runs has a distinguishable color. Because you got to imagine like feeding 2 wires down this front frame leg and through the underside cradle and popping out the back. You won't be able to push and pull one very easily to be able to tell which wire is which. It's a lot easier to say, hey, that one's green and yellow. And green is the neutral and yellow is the oil. Green and yellow. Green is the neutral, yellow is the oil. Way easier. So what I do is use the luxury of a computer. And I'll zoom in on this in a sec here. Let me disconnect from the folding A-frame ladder tripod rigmarole that we got here, and I'll do some close-ups on these drawings so you can see what we got.